The Panth-Punjab project is unique because we bring together thought leaders from Punjab and beyond for seminars that go into the roots of the issues.
Our focus is on the Panth and Punjab, two deeply interlinked entities with a shared history of mobilizing and resisting oppression.
All of our seminars will be available on your favourite podcast platforms for you to listen to and interact with our team. Follow and subscribe to get each episode as soon as it's out.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Since September 18th this year, we've seen an international focus on India's targeting of Sikh descent following the announcement by Canadian PM that directly linked Bhai Hardeep Singh's June 18th assassination to the Indian state. On the 22nd of November, the Financial Times broke a story about how the attempted assassination of Gurpatwant Singh Pannun was thwarted. Then a week later, a 15-page indictment against an Indian intelligence asset, a suspected former drug trafficker, Nikhil Gupta, was made public. Today, we're in conversation with the founding editor of the Panth-Punjab Project, Parmjit Singh. Parmjit Singh is a Panthic activist who's been involved in Sikh student organising, Panthic Jathedar and grassroots political movements for over 15 years. He has an MA in South Asian Studies from SOAS, where he focused on the intellectual history of the Khalistani movement. His ongoing work on Sikh political theory has been published on a number of platforms based in Punjab, as well as the diaspora. We'll be speaking with Parmjit Singh about the details of this indictment and what we have learned from this major revelation. Before we look at the details of the indictment itself and what it reveals, Parmjit Singh, what is the context within which these assassinations have unfolded? If we can trace these assassinations to the targeted killing in Lahore of underground guerrilla commander Shaheed by Harmeet Singh, PhD, in January 2020, how do we then view this continuation of targeting of Sikhs?
Yeah, so I would actually take it back even further than 2020, because I think everything that's happened by Harmeet Singh, te jada hamla hoya, by Parmjit Singh Panjwar, by Avtar Singh Khanda, by Hardeep Singh, and now this the attempt against by Gurpatwant Singh. None of this is happening in a vacuum, obviously, but there's a deep context that's really important for us to understand. And these aren't isolated incidents like they're trying to portray. This isn't about some kind of intra-gang rivalry or local conflicts and stuff. This is a part of an actual a transnational assassination program that's being run by Indian intelligence against Sikh and the Kashmiri activists right now. But to go back even further, I think it's important to understand the context coming out of the 90s and like the infrastructure that Indian security and intelligence has pretty much established during that period. The Hathiarband Sangharsh that Sikhs fought in Punjab in the 80s and 90s was one of the like most significant security threats to India at that time. And if you look at their security infrastructure, their counterinsurgency operations, their techniques, their models and everything like that, a lot of that, like Punjab was kind of the laboratory where a lot of that stuff was developed, and then it was later used in Kashmir, the Northeast, and in other areas as well. And obviously there's overlap and back and forth in different phases, but you see the 80s and 90s are a significant kind of turning point. So during that time, the targeting of Sikhs at that time was this idea of anti-Sikh violence isn't just targeting Sikh bodies necessarily, but it's also Sikh politics. Anybody who raises their head with a Sikh identity, like you see this in the targeting of Amritari Naujawan specifically. When you look at human rights reports and documents and stuff like that, you see that there was a specific strategy to target Amritari Naujawan, anybody with a Kesari Parna or Dadi case, that was Sabat Surat. So you're seeing this elimination of not just Khalistani politics, but any manifestation of Sikh-centric politics. That's completely eliminated out of the public sphere, moving into the 90s, where now the politics are all about Punjabiyat, about Punjab, Punjabis, and this idea of neoliberal development. So what you're seeing is it's a complete erasure of Sikh politics, Sikh public being from the political sphere at that time. So in that context is understanding that there has been in the last like 5, 10, 15 years, if you really go back, there has been this regrouping and this like mobilization in Punjab again, where that threat is being seen. The other thing that I think is important to understand and kind of underscore here is understanding the rise of the BJP and their strategy of transforming India into a Hindu Rashtra, and what role Punjab, Kashmir, the Northeast, and other regions and communities play in that strategy. So when you look at when the BJP comes into power in 2014, even before that, they've already been kind of laying track. There's been these attempts of how do we address and contain Sikh resistance specifically. And what that looks like is there's a lot of kind of covert operations that are being done by different middlemen or representatives that are being sent to the West to try and co-opt and appease different jujharoo factions, the ਜਿਹੜੀ Khalistani terrain, ਬਾਹਰ ਰਹਿੰਦੀਆਂ. And obviously that didn't really go anywhere. After that, when you see the rise of the BJP in 2014, and then in their election, their second election in 2019, is you see this very serious and aggressive ramping up of that strategy. And so if we take Kashmir as an example first, I think it's really helpful to understand what's kind of happening parallel to Punjab and within the Panth and the Sikh targets that are being targeted. So in Kashmir, pretty much as soon as they came into power, the 2019 election happens, and then in August, they pretty much dismantle Kashmir as an entity, all its autonomous status, the constitutional provisions that it had for its own kind of form of self-government and all this kind of stuff. When Kashmir is completely dismantled in 2019, you see the clampdown and this, the internet blackouts, the house arrests of a lot of political activists and stuff. But that's not how that entire process starts. What they had initially done, they targeted a lot of the militant resistance, but they also fomented a lot of internal strife and conflict within Kashmiri factions themselves. And what they did is pretty much completely undermined everybody's credibility, from the militant factions to you can say the radical factions that were involved in kind of radical organizing overground, to even the moderate factions that are within government that are Indian nationalists, but still articulating something for Kashmir. They pretty much fomented conflict within all of them. They undermined all of each other's kind of credibility, and they incentivized fragmentation, where all of these kind of entities or different streams of resistance were pretty much into like splinter groups and stuff like that. So when 2019 happens, they kind of are at this moment where they're able to dismantle Kashmir, which used to be kind of this massive bastion of resistance to Indian imperialism. And since 2019, they've been able to kind of maintain a stranglehold. Obviously, it's because of this violent occupation that's happening in Kashmir, but there's this political element of how Hindutva and the BJP is trying to assert its control over these regions. When you look at the Northeast, you're seeing something similar kind of happening to this region that was, again, another bastion of conflict and resistance, to this situation where the BJP is coming in on landslide victories in some of the states there. So now when you look at Punjab, you have a similar strategy. And when you look at the series from 2019 to now, it's a period of like 4 years. In 2019, if you speak to Sikh activists in Punjab and in the diaspora, there were already some whispers that were coming out, some warnings that were coming out that, be extra careful, be cautious of your surroundings, that something is kind of stirring. January 2020, then you have the assassination of Bhai Harmeet Singh in Pakistan. After that, pretty much COVID hits, the Kisan Morcha kicks off, and I think a lot of things kind of fall flat and go silent. Soon as the Kisan Morcha is finished and, the COVID lockdowns are kind of wrapping up and kind of returning to normalcy, in 2022, we have these warnings that are received in Canada to Bhai Hardeep Singh and a number of other Sikh activists in Canada. And then in 2023, you have the rapid kind of succession assassinations against Bhai Parmjit Singh, Avtar Singh Khanda, Hardeep Singh, and this attempt against Gurpatwant Singh. So when you're looking at this kind of strategy that the BJP has of how does it assert control in Punjab, one is when, the strategy of appeasement and co-optation, of kind of opening negotiations with certain factions and trying to bring them back into the Indian mainstream, doesn't go anywhere. They're targeting those militant factions ਜਿਹੜੀ ਆਪਣੀ ਜੁਝਾਰੂ ਧਿਰ ਹੈਗੀ of Sikh leadership. And once that kind of that defense mechanism or that wall is eliminated, they've already laid track within other Sikh factions. If you look at the Akali Dal and how it's splintered into so many different factions, even if you look at the Congress Party in Punjab, they splintered into different factions. The attacks and undermining, rightfully so, of the Aam Aadmi Party on a lot of points, but the way that every faction in Punjab is being mobilized to attack each other and to pretty much lose all credibility and legitimacy, and then incentivizing different fragments that are trying to cozy up to the BJP as much as possible. So if you look at the Haryana Gurdwara Prabandhak Committee, if you look at the Delhi Prabandhak Committee, you're seeing kind of the trailer of what's happening in Punjab, and we now see that kind of on the horizon with SGPC elections that are coming up. You have multiple factions that are fighting amongst each other, and every single faction is trying to curry favor and kind of cozy up to the BJP to pretty much get their patronage and like their tapi to be able to be successful. And the BJP is mindful of that and is continuing to have all of these factions fighting with each other. Nobody is actually coming up and being the dominant there and kind of taking control anymore. So what you have is a situation of complete chaos. And you look at Haryana and Delhi are kind of the examples. Kashmir is the kind of perfect example of that. And you kind of see that strategy working out in Punjab now. So this targeted assassination of Sikh activists in the diaspora is something that I think is very possible and feasible that we'll see in Punjab in the near future. And it's going alongside the polarization within Sikh circles and factions, as well as with other communities within Punjab, to fragment and polarize the entire political environment for the BJP to be able to kind of completely assert its dominance and control from Punjab, which has always been this kind of stronghold of resistance, so that it can kind of take its next stepping stone towards a Hindu Rashtra.
So you mentioned this, that we could start seeing this type of assassination targeted specifically at individuals in organizing or leadership positions that we've seen in the diaspora. We could start seeing that in Punjab. But as many of our listeners will know, the Punjab's context already, there's been no closure around like decades of state violence, right? We've seen like mass genocide, we've seen targeting of Sikh guerrillas, their family members in particular, and as you mentioned, Amritari Naujawan. If there's been no closure on that side, how do you view that period of violence and this period of violence? Do you see them as reflections of each other, or is there like a marked shift in the scale of state violence from the 1980s to now?
I think what's happening right now in the context, it's important to tie into the first part of what I talked about of what the BJP strategy is. And I think there is a significant shift. The security infrastructure that the Indian state established in its counterinsurgency in Punjab, eliminating any Sikh-centric politics altogether, Khalistani or otherwise, completely from the mainstream. In the last 10 to 15 years, you've steadily seen this simmering of this mobilization again, and we see it every few years. In the late 2000s, you had the entire Morcha against the Sacha Sauda data, and that entire kind of phenomenon that was happening with state backing. In 2012, you have the Morcha against Balwant Singh Rajawana's Phansi. 2013, 2014, you have massive Morche for the release of Bandi Singhs. In 2015, you have massive mobilizations against Beadabi that's happening in Punjab. You have the Bargadi Morcha that comes literally right after that. And then you have the Kisan Morcha happening in 2020. And consecutively, the pattern has been, what this is showing us is that our generation, that's coming of age from like the late 80s, the 90s, they are continuing down that path, opening up that range and that realm and that kind of that line of politics of Sikh political mobilization and what it looks like. And in Punjab, people, there's all of these comments about, there's no groundswell of support for Khalistan in Punjab. It's a fringe element. You have to kind of read between the lines and understand, like we said, we're coming from this context of genocide. When literally, if you look like us, wearing a Damalla, Dada Prakash, you're a target for state violence. So even now, like that infrastructure is maintained through like UAPA, for example, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which is India's anti-terror legislation. For Naujawan who do start to get into a certain realm of political activism, even for like, joining WhatsApp groups where the title is Khalistani Zindabad, talking about a referendum in Punjab or other kind of Panthak mobilization, you pretty much get arrested under the anti-terror legislation. You're kept in custody for anywhere from like 5 to 10 years. You don't have the possibility of bail. By that time, financially, you're completely destroyed. You're in the system. You're being surveillanced and harassed even once you leave prison. That atmosphere for political mobilization has been so restricted that India has always sought to maintain its control. With all of these successive morche that we're seeing, though, you're seeing the fear of the state slowly kind of fading away. You're seeing an increased kind of bold political advocacy from Panthak Naujawan on the ground in Punjab. And I think with the Kisan Morcha was a significant turning point. In the Kisan Morcha, that idea of fear of the police and of the state or trying to work within the system, jinne bhi veham parmasi ke sare tot gaye si. And even after that, even if you look at the kind of electoral arena, there is no hope, there is no credibility or legitimacy for electoral politics or electoral solutions. There have been, even since then, consistent mobilization. So if you look at the Kisan Morcha, the barricades that were pretty much swept away by Naujawan, the clashes with police that were happening brazenly and openly. Even earlier this year in Mohali, where there's a morcha for Bandi Singh, and even whatever happened in Ajnala in February, there's been a steady rise and a building in terms of the frustration and the jazba of Panthak Naujawan on the ground who are trying to channel that energy in a constructive direction to further this Sangharsh. And I think that is also kind of a part of the equation of what the calculations and the kind of political analysis that the Indian state is doing is how do we now reinstill fear in Naujawan and the general kind of Sangat and people of Punjab, and how do you reestablish and reassert control of a police state? And I think the assassination program is a part of that, is how do you kind of, even in the diaspora now, how do you kind of strike fear in the hearts of people who are living out in Canada and the US and the UK who are engaging in Panthak activism and are now thinking, okay, what does this look like now in terms of being targeted for assassination?
The question I was trying to ask around closure was about like it feels like we haven't gotten over one period of Indian state violence and now we're thrown into another. And the fear is that these two will be seen as separate. And they are separate, obviously, in many ways, in terms of the scale of violence, the brutality of violence, of how the entire machinery was. Right? And, rightly so, Sikhs were making comparisons with like the Mughal Raj time when Singha they said the mull pe sige. But for me, it feels like this violence and these assassinations are being looked at in isolation. And even in the analysis that's coming out from, outside of the Panth, Khalistan and the 80s is problematized as, Sikhs were carrying out this violence. The Khalistan movement was very violent, not saying that actually it was the Indian state that was carrying out the same type of violence for the same effect, to eliminate Sikh political discourse, to stop Sikhs from pursuing their sovereignty. And I feel like that disconnect is obviously is happening in the mainstream media, but also amongst like Sikh discourse. It's almost like we're jumping from one incident to another, even in, the Gurpatwant Singh assassination attempt by Hardeep Singh is like becoming like a footnote, right? Like everything is moving without understanding how these pieces are connected to each other. So that's like my frustration with some of the conversation. There's this broken continuity between the genocidal counterinsurgency policy and these targeted killings. So you mentioned how there's this rising mobilizations, this rising spirit among Sikhs. And you also talked about like the BJP's strategy of trying to contest Sikh dissent and, and instill that fear. So do you think the Indian state is feeling threatened by Sikhs?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's very, very clear. And I think it's hard to talk about all these different time periods and all of this context because I think we have a tendency to isolate everything, and that these assassinations are something different and separate that are happening on their own, and it's hard to kind of connect it to the wider context. And then to kind of even to bring it with its larger context, bringing in the 80s and 90s. But I think obviously you have to go much further, that this is an ongoing political struggle. And for us, a Tarmi struggle is a Tarmi for us from 1849. And that context has been building and kind of developing in different ways. And if you really want to get into the weeds on that front, I think even in 1849, so the Governor General of the British colonial Indian state at that time, after 1849, when the British under the Hajipar Lagareya, he says very, very clearly in his letters, I don't remember the exact quote, but it's something like explicitly to the effect of, until we absolutely destroy the Sikh political power in this region, in Punjab specifically, we will never be able to have stable control and domination over all of South Asia. Destroying and eliminating Sikh political power, it was a prerequisite for the British to be able to establish their Indian empire. That has been a continuous theme and element of every political power and establishment since 1849. So when we look at the continuities of the assassination program that's happening right now, Sikh mobilization that's happening right now, we're seeing it. This is absolutely its own phase. This isn't just a continuation of the Sangharsh from the 80s and 90s. That chapter or that phase has come to a close. And this is kind of our generation reopening or writing the next chapter. But it is the same book and this continuous struggle against the same political power. And I think that's important for us to really digest and kind of understand what that means for us. And so in terms of the threat that we talked about, like the BJP came in even before 2014, like we talked about, is how do we neutralize and undermine the Sikh threat, even before they came into power in 2014. And obviously everything that's happened since then, this is an active political conflict between two entities. And so our initiative, our agency is also like impacting and driving their different decisions that are kind of being taken right now. And so in terms of being a threat, I think absolutely we always have. But I think specifically in the last few years, especially since the Kisan Morcha, even though the assassination program was developed and kind of deployed before that happened, I think the Kisan Morcha has shifted the political trajectory of this entire region permanently in a way that I think we still need to unpack. But just in terms of spark notes is the fact that of the state that we had already kind of talked about. But even for the Indian state to see the gravity of the threat in the immediacy of it, and the fact that we mobilized all across the subcontinent, and that other oppressed and marginalized groups and communities were also looking kind of at this mobilization and joining it and looking at Punjab as this kind of vanguard force again against Indian imperialism and Hindutva fascism. I think that threat, I think, is very real, which is one of the reasons this attempt at polarizing even politics within Punjab, within Dalit or against Dalit communities, against Muslim migration that's coming in, and even with Punjabi Muslim populations, with economic migrant labor that's coming to Punjab. There's a host of issues and social issues that need to be dealt with in Punjab. But the Indian state is trying to activate fault lines against Punjab, against Sikhs and Hindus, against Sikhs and Dalits, against Sikhs and Muslims, trying to activate caste fault lines and trying to pretty much destabilize Punjab so that there's no cohesive force anymore. But that also, when India is able to kind of build this quote unquote extremist fringe that's kind of based on this xenophobic ethno-nationalism, they're able to demonize Sikhs across the rest of the subcontinent and rest of the world as well. So those kind of ties of solidarity that were being developed and that kind of social and political capital is something that's also in the Indian state is seeking to disrupt and destroy. From a purely strategic perspective right now, in terms of the threat, is understanding where Punjab is geostrategically located. We're on one of the main land routes for trade that's going to go from the subcontinent into Central Asia on into Europe or the Middle East and stuff as well. On top of that, military supply lines, if there's border conflict in Aksai Chin with China or anywhere in Kashmir with Pakistan, all of those military supply lines are running through Punjab. So if there's unrest, if there's conflict, if there's resistance in Punjab, it's a mortal threat to the Indian state in terms of its survival. If you have internal strife and conflict, on top of that, coupled with kind of border conflict with like other countries, that's something that's really, really difficult to come back from. And that's something that India is mindful of. So during the Kisan Morcha, you had Indian intelligence officials, you had retired officials, Amarjit Singh Dullat, who was the former chief of RAW, going on the record saying very clearly that Modi needs to repeal these bills because India cannot survive another conflict with Sikhs, especially in today's current climate. You had political kind of establishment figures, former cabinet ministers of the BJP. You had their sitting governors in other states like Meghalaya and stuff like that who were saying the same thing. And there were repeated media stories coming out from military and army officials as well, saying that, you know, if there's unrest and this conflict continues to boil, we're not going to be able to withstand that. And it's going to be a significant kind of strategic threat. So I think all of these things kind of taken into account paint a very serious picture of what the political realities are of Punjab right now. And the assassination program obviously fits into that context. It was something that was already conceptualized and was being deployed. But I think the urgency and the aggressive nature of it and its use as a domestic political tool isn't something that can be overlooked.
So that brings us quite neatly into this particular indictment. So with Bhai Harmeet Singh Shaheed in January 2020, it doesn't register on like the international news in any way, and arguably even among Sikhs, right? Like his shakhsiyat, like his role that he played in the Sangharsh doesn't register. But with this indictment, what we see with Bhai Hardeep Singh, because of where they're happening in Canada and America, it's become this massive international story. And with the indictment in particular, this is a kind of a detailed look at how Indian intelligence assets were operating. And it's been quite revealing. So in terms of the indictment, what stands out to you in the actual 15-page document? What are the key things that you think Sikhs should know about?
I think going to some of the things that you said earlier, though, like in terms of the seriousness with which the situation is viewed, I think for us, for Panth ke Naujawan, who are active in the Sangharsh, or at least kind of keep an ear close to the ground, this was raised as an issue in 2020 with Bhai Harmeet Singh Shaheed. And in May, on May 6th, when Bhai Parmjit Singh Panjwar was assassinated, we were able to connect the dots. When Avtar Singh Khanda is killed, Hardeep Singh's assassination happens. For us, it's very, very clear, and we knew exactly what was happening. But it's very easy for others to kind of paint us with this, you know, conspiracy theorist kind of brush and gaslight us that, oh, like, you know, no, it's just in your head. It's just a coincidence or there's some kind of other explanation. And slowly, as information has kind of trickled out, I think even within our own community and obviously kind of internationally, it's becoming a little bit more and more clear as, you know, this information is being drip fed. Slowly, there's a trickle of a leaked source here, a news kind of article here, but it's slowly all the pieces are coming together. Now it's come to a point where really for any rational person, it's undeniable that India has this coordinated transnational assassination program against Sikh activists and others as well that we haven't spoken about, but that's a part of the context as well, that this is happening to other communities as well right now. In the indictment, though, in a nutshell, I think a lot of people are probably familiar with most of the details, but the individual who's been named in this indictment and the person who's been charged isn't the main conspirator, nor is it the person who's kind of orchestrated this entire thing. Nikhil Gupta is essentially the middle person that was recruited as an Indian intelligence asset by the Indian state to coordinate the assassination in the New York area. So within the indictment, and this is kind of also indicative of how foreign policy and international relations are going to play into this entire thing. There's a lot of excitement and optimism within a lot of people about, the US is going to get us justice. They're going to confront India and solve this entire thing. Everybody is still it's a firm, but it's still a very subdued and muted tone with India. And the fact that they're identifying very clearly that there's an Indian government official who is the one who recruited Gupta in the first place, but that person remains unnamed and no repercussions, is also telling of how the US and Canada's relationship with India is going to continue to inform how they address and deal with the situation. But it's undeniable that there was an individual that's an Indian government official with responsibilities in security and intelligence, with a background in the CRPF, which is an Indian paramilitary force, that recruited Nikhil Gupta, who had pretty much a criminal background in drugs and weapons trafficking, who was recruited to carry out the assassination. Now, the electronic communication that's been released in the indictment starts in early May. And that starting point of that conversation is the fact that Gupta had criminal charges that were pending against him in Gujarat. And this intelligence officer, the handler, pretty much strikes a deal with Gupta saying, we'll pretty much make those charges go away if you do this for us. May 12th, it's confirmed that, yeah, those charges have been, they're gone. I talked to the boss. The charges have been taken care of. We can talk to the local DC if you need to, the deputy commissioner. And on May 29th is when the communication really kind of kicks off, where Gupta then reaches out to somebody that's a criminal associate who was also providing information to law enforcement, who then puts Gupta in touch with an undercover officer who's posing as a hitman. So I think the first piece is really laying the methodology of the Indian state and intelligence, that this is being quarterbacked and guided and led by them. And they are pretty much hiring criminal elements in the diaspora and other countries in exchange for different favors, for impunity, that you need to orchestrate and carry out this hit for us locally. The background that Gupta has this is something that's a tangent that I think maybe we can talk about afterwards if you want to circle back to it, but I think his background in drug trafficking is extremely significant. That's one piece of it. Then getting into the actual conversation and communications that are happening between Gupta and his handler, as well as Gupta and the undercover officer who he thinks is going to be the hitman. As the conversation is evolving, when Gupta is initially contacted, the handler tells him that we have a target in California and in New York. He gets hired on to take care of the New York target, who is Gurpatwant Singh Pannun. And as that conversation develops, it becomes very clear that Gupta is talking about multiple targets. At one point, the handler, this is in early June, I think it's around June 12th, but I could be off by a few days. But the handler contacts Gupta about a big target in Canada. And this is early June, before Hardeep Singh's target. Gupta contacts the hitman and says that, hey, we need another person for a job in Canada. We're looking for a good team to take care of that. We have a lot of jobs. We're going to keep you busy. There's a lot of targets. We're going to get them all done. On June 18th, when Bhai Hardeep Singh attains Shaheedi at Sri Gurdwara, on that very night, Gupta's handler sends him a video of Hardeep Singh after he's been shot. And he pretty much tells him, ramp up the timeline. You pretty much need to make this happen against Gurpatwant Singh right away. Gupta then goes and starts talking to the hitman, telling him, this was also our job. We gave it to somebody else who took care of it. And now there's we have 4 more jobs to do. One was against Gurpatwant Singh and 3 more in Canada. So clearly from these communications, the details that are being shared back and forth, this is a coordinated campaign that's being run by Indian intelligence, and it's not just by Hardeep Singh, it's not just against Gurpatwant Singh or anybody else who's been assassinated already. This is aimed at targeting a number that there's no concrete endpoint that we have, but it's multiple people, multiple Sikh activists and Nojwan who are being targeted. So from my perspective, I think those are the key takeaways, is the undeniable link with Indian intelligence and kind of how they're at the center of orchestrating this, the nature of Gupta's background and how he's been recruited, and the fact that this is a coordinated campaign. There are a number of targets who are clearly still out there that the Indian state is still targeting.
So what you're talking about is this really coordinated effort of, some have described it as transnational repression, of India exerting its military and intelligence force in order to specifically target Sikhs. And around this, whole episode that we've been seeing unfolding, we've also seen conversation in the Sikh community from some quarters that has talked about how now Canada and the United States are going to stand with Sikhs. In the UK, it's been slightly different. I think, the government here has been very overtly supportive of India. So that conversation hasn't really kind of gone in that way. But it seems, especially from Canada and America, there's been this discussion about how, even Trudeau's revelations in Parliament were used as an example of Trudeau now, Sadi gal karti hai, and, Trudeau is now like a hero almost of Sikhs. And with this indictment, some are saying that this is evidence now of the United States stand with the Sikh community, that now India is in the dock, essentially. But if we look at the role of India's allies, following like Jaggi's arrest in 2016, it's become clear that intelligence was provided by the British government to India that directly led to Jaggi's arrest. Then in 2018, there was police raids on the houses of Sikh activists in the UK that were coordinated due to the relationship between India and the UK. In fact, like the police even tweeted about that, saying we're carrying out raids, counter-terrorism raids at addresses in the UK related to extremist activity in India. And then following that, we saw the very high-profile extradition attempt of 3 Sikhs in the UK, the West Midlands 3, and in relation to high-profile policing and intelligence operations, we've seen travel bans being enacted against Sikh Nojwan. We've seen financial restrictions being placed, including upon by Hardeep Singh, by the Canadian government. We've seen public safety report in 2018 in Canada used to demonize Sikh support for Khalistan. A similar thing has happened in the UK with this invention of this pro-Khalistan extremism term that's come from a report by an arguably unqualified individual, Colin Bloom, in the UK. But that term has been adopted, and the Prime Minister of the UK has used that term in speaking to the media in India. So we've seen, the allies of India, actively participate, collude, demonize, and target Sikh activism. So how can we then understand the role of India's allies? What does this tell us about our position and our sangharsh and our struggle when we look at Canada, America, and the UK?
So I think you've laid a lot of the details out. Even like in the context that you just gave and in the question itself, is now it's the thing for us to do now is understand the nature of the relationship and what are the interests that are kind of at play. So I think from the Western perspective, the G7 countries specifically, there is kind of two things or two interests that I think are at play. Firstly is understanding kind of this fear mongering that's happening about the quote unquote rise of China, and whatever threat this is going to be. There's a lot of we don't need to get into the weeds of like academic debate around that and how that's being projected in these countries. But one is China is becoming a larger and larger power, specifically in that entire region. The US and these other countries have an interest in militarily and politically containing China and trying to restrict its influence in the region. ਜਿਹੜੀ ਦੂਜੀ ਗੱਲ ਹੈਗੀ ਆ that makes this even more significant. If you look at economic forecasts right now, 2/3 of the global GDP is set to be kind of based in that Asian region in the next 20 to 30 years. So that's a massive amount of money in terms of the economic clout, the market, the access to markets that these countries want, the access to resources, the access to trade routes. Obviously, that's incredibly significant. And when Obama went back, he did a tour towards the end of his kind of last term across a lot of these Pacific Asian countries. When he's in Hawaii, he specifically says that American foreign policy has been fixated on the Middle East for far too long, and we now need to kind of pivot to the Far East, to this Asia, Indo-Pacific region, which is a term that's been coined by certain countries to project their vision of what they want this region to look like. So the US, Canada, a bunch of EU countries, Australia, have all published an Indo-Pacific strategy specifically. And in there, they talk about these economic projections, and they talk about what their strategy is to pretty much get in on the ground floor of these economic opportunities and to counter China. And all of that strategy, a significant portion of that strategy revolves around India. India is the Indo and the Indo-Pacific. And all of these countries are talking about how they want to increase ties and trade with India, obviously, investment in India. And they also pretty much want to turn India into a net security provider in the region, which means that they have a vested interest in making India a stable military power. And obviously, it has to be politically stable itself for that to happen. And they want to strengthen India's power so that it can pretty much become what Israel has been in the neighborhood in the Middle East, trying to project India as that kind of a power. So these are the interests that are kind of at play. So for any of these countries to now completely abandon India is impossible. They've pretty much locked themselves in. And so you have that tone and that commentary in every statement coming out from politicians right now, is that India is still a very important ally. It's still a strategic partner. We're not trying to escalate or provoke the situation. We just want to cooperate and we want to deal with the situation. Even the way the US has dealt with it, it's very strong. It's very damning evidence that's been released, but politically they're not taking that strong of a line. And so this is when we're kind of getting into conjecture and kind of hypothesis of what these countries have to gain, or what the play is right now. And what it seems like, and so this is obviously my hypothesis and my reading of the situation, I'm happy to be proven wrong, but it seems like they're using this situation as a leverage over India for certain concessions. Now, whether that's to activate conflict with Pakistan, kind of where the China-Pakistan economic corridor is running from Gwadar to China, whether it's about kind of restructuring India's relationship with China, whether it's moving away from the BRICS kind of formulation that India is active in towards really more strongly and explicitly bringing India into the G7 camp. What the interest is, I think, remains to be said. But I think the tone coming from Canada, the US, the UK, like you said, there's not even much need to kind of really get into the weeds on that, because they've really boldly kind of staked their claim in India. But understanding that context of these relationships, I think, is really important. And with this issue I think the other element or kind of aspect that we really need to kind of break down is also that there is some kind of hesitation with Modi, specifically Hindutva and the rise of the BJP and the kind of political rhetoric and the instability that it's causing in India. If the Western country's interest lies in a strong India as an economic and a military partner, seeing the kind of activation of fault lines all across India because of Hindutva, because of centralization, fascism, and assimilation, which is causing instability, there is some interesting opportunity for reconsideration of what they want India or South Asia to look like to secure their investment. And it seems like increasingly that perhaps Modi isn't it. And so that opens the door to a lot of other conversations that we can have of what that means for our future and how we engage with that. But I think that's starting to veer into a different conversation.
No, it's a really interesting point though, because we've seen with the media discourse, right, how following Trudeau's, so-called revelations in Parliament that linked India to Bhai Hardeep Singh's assassination, to this indictment and how they played out domestically in India. With Canada, it was a very boisterous kind of refusal and a rubbishing of the claims officially from the Indian government. And then behind the scenes, it seems like they were trying to work things out. But with the revelations from America, it seems that the tact has been very different, not only from the Indian government, which has, officially kind of just short of denounced this activity, said that this doesn't represent India, that they're shocked, that this isn't their policy, to Indian media commentators that have been more critical of the Modi government than they have been in a long time, even during the Kasani Sangharsh, like some of these left-wing, news outlets or, so-called centrist news outlets in India, they didn't present as robust a critique of Hindutva and Modi as they are kind of doing now. So I think that's a really important point. And that kind of links into my next question around the role of the Indian media. And it's something that you said earlier about the background of Nikhil Gupta being linked to drugs and arm trafficking. So it seems for a number of years, the Indian media have been printing stories from largely unnamed Indian intelligence sources that have presented this narrative of this Khalistan gang drugs nexus. And in fact, the Indian media has often cited language directly from charge sheets that called Sikh jujharoo jathebandiyan terrorist gangs. And this, in fact, Sikh militant groups have been portrayed varyingly as akin to Islamist groups, as smugglers, and now gangs. How is that significant, especially given the fact that the indictment paints a clear picture of India recruiting this former drug trafficker, given the narrative that India's tried to run in Canada, which was even picked up by, Canadian journalists such as Kim Bolan, who talked about this Khalistani gang feud. How is the role of Gupta significant in that regard? And what does this expose about Indian counter-insurgency operations?
We could literally probably do an entire session just on Indian media and its role and kind of relationship with the Indian state. But I think it's the fundamental point that I want to kind of really emphasize is that the Indian media establishment is kind of like the advance team for their police, army, and paramilitary forces. So whenever there's going to be some kind of violence perpetrated by the state, whenever there's going to be some kind of security crackdown, it's the media that goes in before that and prepares the ground. And this idea, this process of manufacturing consent, I think is really, really important and relevant in our case. So I think even going back into the 80s, I'll give you two examples. So one is B.D. Pandey, who was India's governor in that 82 to 84 period. He's originally from Kerala, which is the south of India. So when he gets appointed as governor, he writes this in his book. I forget the exact title, "In the Service of Free India" or something like that. So he's writing this, his memoir, his biography, and his experience in one chapter, one section is specifically on Punjab. And he talks about going to Punjab in, I think, 82, maybe 83. And when he first arrives, he's walking around for the first week and he's just completely baffled and confused because things were completely normal. And he talks about how the way that Indian media outside of Punjab is portraying this picture that Punjab is on fire, there is rampant organized crime, there's militant activity, people are being massacred, there's, things are blowing up, things are being set on fire on a regular basis. And he's like, I've been here for like a week or two and I'm literally not seeing any of that. And he pretty much indicts Indian media for creating this kind of image of this urgency and this fear that's created in the rest of India that then kind of becomes the precursor to the actual Indian state violence that comes right after that. Jaspal Singh Sidhu is another example who worked for the Press Trust of India, which is kind of their news syndicate agency organization. He gives a lot of examples. He's written multiple books, embedded journalism in English, and he's written a book in Punjabi, June 84 di Patrakari, or something to that effect. He gives very specific examples of when he would send stories back to his editors in Delhi, how the story would be warped when it was published the next day, and how pretty much news media at that time was literally just disseminating police and army press releases. So if the police said that, oh, this Naujawan was killed here, he was trying to escape, and they opened fire, or his accomplices opened fire, so then police had to fire back and there was an encounter and he was killed. Nobody would really question those stories or those narratives. They would literally just publish that this is what happened. So understanding that dynamic of the media historically in Punjab, and as it relates to anti-Sikh violence, and now tying that back to what's happening right now. So I think in terms of the media, there's two streams that I think are important. Firstly, like you talked about, the question that you asked was specifically around Gupta's background as a drug trafficker. So over the past 5 to 10 years, Indian intelligence and media, in complete coordination, have been amplifying this narrative of quote-unquote narco-terrorism, of Sikh activists, that they're the Khalistan and these militant organizations are supposedly just drug runners, smuggling and making money off of this, and they're pretty much the gangs and criminal organized crime in Punjab is integrated with Khalistani terrorism. So the objective of this strategy, one, is to discredit the politics and character of the Sangharsh itself, and the other is to create this pretext for violence, that the state can now kill Khalistani activists, and it can also kill quote-unquote gangsters with impunity because they're justified legitimate targets now. Because the gangsters are now Khalistanis and the Khalistanis are now gangsters, you can kill and eradicate both, and there's no consent for it because they have been painted in a certain way that makes them legitimate targets for violence. The other element to that is also, like we've seen specifically in the media narrative around Bhai Harmeet Singh's assassination, Bhai Parmjit Singh Panjwar's assassination, Bhai Avtar Singh Khanda's, Bhai Hardeep Singh's assassination. All of them, the media narrative that's trickled out of India, that's been picked up in, like you said, Kim Bolan, Terry Glavin, and others as well, is this idea that this was because of inter-gang rivalry. It's because these Khalistani elements are imbricated into organized crime, that this is just different gangs killing each other because of their own personal beefs. So it completely takes the onus off the Indian state. And it also creates this image that Khalistanis are just fighting amongst themselves, and so they are killing each other. This isn't our problem. We've seen it in all of those examples in the narrative that they've tried to spin. Nikhil Gupta, having his background and being the face of the contract, being involved in organized crime and drug trafficking, continues to kind of substantiate that entire narrative, and it also illustrates India's methodology. It kind of shows how they're trying to hire these criminal elements to carry out the assassination, so that they can maintain this narrative. So when you see some of the news stories when Bhai Avtar Singh Khanda was killed and when Bhai Hardeep Singh was killed, a lot of stories are trying to paint the picture that they killed each other, or it's a retaliation for each other's assassinations and stuff, and trying to build this story that Khalistanis are just killing each other and that this is all around kind of inter-gang rivalry. And so this is another kind of interrelated point. When we talk about how India is trying to fragment and polarize Sikh factions against each other in Punjab, there is certain conspiracies and certain narratives that are being amplified by known Indian intelligence assets, or at least partners, even going back to the Sangharsh in the 80s and 90s. And so without getting into the merits or the details of the argument of either side, but the killing of Harminder Singh Sandhu in 1990 is being built up as this inter-gang rivalry that the Khalistanis were just killing each other, but it's also creating ground and trying to establish a certain sentiment against the Khadku Jathebandiyan and against the Sangharsh itself. And even when you see the example of Bhai Parmjit Singh Panjwar after his assassination, there's a number of so-called Panthik, Agu, and individuals who are openly celebrating the assassination of Bhai Parmjit Singh, tying it to this entire narrative of Harminder Singh Sandhu, which is being driven and galvanized by India's own kind of bots and kind of cyber cells. So I think in terms of the gang narrative, I think that's incredibly important and relevant. The other thing is also painting this picture of Punjab and of the violence that's happening even in the past few months. It's the media and this narrative is used as the justification for violence. Even if you go back now to the Kisan Morcha, around the end there, where there was ek bande ne Guru Granth Sahib Ji di beadbi ਕੀਤੀ ਸੀ ਤੇ ਉਹਦਾ ਸੌਦਾ ਲੱਗਾ ਸੀ, Indian media started picking up this narrative of lynchings and trying to pretty much activate a caste divide, that Sikhs are intentionally targeting marginalized caste, oppressed caste individuals, accusing them of beadbi, and kind of taking out this kind of caste supremacy, completely trying to undermine the legitimacy and the credibility of Sikh political mobilization. After that, especially in the last year, the way that this image has been painted in the national media and the space that's been given to certain individuals and certain narratives in Punjab to create this image that Punjab is on fire, it's on the brink. And we see that especially in January, February, March, when India was going to kind of crack down on Sikh activists all across the state and arresting upwards to 1,000 people, and a number of individuals who were pretty much intimidated by police for posting on social media. If you go back to June and to February, if you read the editorials that are being published in the Indian Express, in the print, in the Tribune, they're all painting this picture of doom and gloom that Punjab fir hathon bas jana laya. There is rampant violence that's being unchecked and the military needs to clamp down. There is an editorial where Punjab needs another Panth Singh, who's pretty much credited for the genocide in the 90s and the counterinsurgency operations. And you see this media narrative laying the track for the paramilitary operation that happens in March itself. So the relationship between media in India and security agencies and intelligence is pretty much completely hand in glove. And these media narratives are used to pretty much justify and manufacture consent for the violence that's going to happen right after.
So that brings me to the final question. Around the assassinations of Bhai Avtar Singh, Bhai Hardeep Singh, and even before that, Bhai Harmeet Singh, and now this attempt on Gurpatwant Singh, how has the language and the perception of Khalistan been impacted? And where do we go from here? We know, like during the Sangharsh, the Khadkus gave us a level of protection. One example that comes to mind is in Romania when jujharoos wanted to assassinate a former Indian police officer, Ribeiro, who had been posted in Romania. There was an attempt on Ribeiro's life. and the Singhs involved in that action were arrested, detained in Romania, and treated very badly. The lawyers arrived. The lawyers, from the Sikh side, they weren't taken seriously at all. Following this whole kind of incident, Radu, a Romanian diplomat, gets kidnapped by the KLF in India. And one of the key conversations is around how the Singhs are being treated in Romania. And following that kidnapping, the conversation and the language completely changed. Romania actually flew the Sikh lawyers back into Romania. The treatment of the Singhs changed completely overnight. So we know like that the Kharkus on the ground give us a level of protection, and international law provides no such protection. I mean, as this recording is taking place, we're seeing, massive bombardment in Gaza. Thousands and thousands of Palestinians have been killed, and international law isn't providing any kind of protection, or not even a call for a ceasefire has become a contentious point. So where do we go from here in this particular moment?
So I think in terms of the next steps, I think and there's a lot of different pieces and angles and perspectives that we need to kind of digest and process. But for me, the most significant thing is really understanding the gravity of our situation, the threats and challenges that we're facing, and the massive opportunities. We are literally we talked a lot about the entire context, what's happening in Punjab, what's happening in all of South Asia and India more broadly. We've talked about this entire region and kind of the geopolitical shifts that are happening right now. We are literally on the cusp of a potentially like completely new world that we're not going to be able to recognize in a few decades. And we are kind of at this moment and this point where we are at the focal point at this moment in time, where that region that is the most coveted, that is the most desired, we are not just an entity that exists there, we are a massive stakeholder. So for me, I think the most important things are really understanding the gravity of that situation, grasping the nature of the threat that we're facing. Like we talked in a lot of detail in the beginning about how the Indian state is trying to fragment and polarize and pretty much scatter our own forces and all of our own organizations and our Sangat, so that we don't actually have a Bajama Tora that's able to actually respond and take this forward. And I think like the examples you gave, during the Sangharsh, we had a Tora, the Panth was organized and mobilized on its own terms with their own sovereign Panthic institutions, all the way from our Panthic decision-making, the Sarvat Khalsa, the Panthic committee that was established, the political mobilization that was happening, and the Hathiarband, the jujharoo Jathebandiyan. Our solution, our defense, ultimately, jehda apna Avtar hona, oh Guru Granth, Guru Panth di sharan de vich aa ke hi ho sakda. So at this moment in time, like our biggest priority needs to be reinvesting in our own institutions. We've done this thing where we've looked externally for the media to hear our story or to convince the right politicians. We've gotten to the point now where they're literally assassinating our Naujawan in Canada. Canada is not able to provide protection to make sure that it doesn't happen. Canada isn't really going out there to hold India accountable and to stop it from happening altogether. Nor is Canada really out there and waving our flag to solve our political solution in our own dish, and solving these all of these underlying issues once and for all. So for us, as understanding that, how do we reorganize and remobilize on a local level? How do we take that kind of local level consensus building, trust building kind of initiatives and local mobilization and scale it up into larger Panthic organization? How do we reestablish our Panthic Tora, where Guru Granth, Guru Panth are at the center? Our ongoing Sangharsh for Khalistan is at the center. This idea, jehda hun Maharaj ne sade te zimmewari saumpi hegi a halemi raj sirjan di, how do we take that forward in today's current political climate, the circumstances facing the threats and opportunities that we have before us today? And with that is all of the institutions, all of the mechanisms of power that we need for ourselves is ਜਿਵੇਂ ਮਹਾਰਾਜ ਵੀ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਹੁਕਮ ਦਿੰਦੇ ਹੈਗੇ ਵੀ ਆਪਣ ਹੱਥੀਂ ਆਪਣਾ ਆਪੇ ਹੀ ਕਾਜ ਸਵਾਰੀ ਹੈ, that having any kind of ask or hope from anybody else is not only futile but also pretty much erodes what it means to be a Sikh and our Sikhi in and of itself. ਆਪਾਂ ਇਸ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਤੇ ਸਿੱਖ ਹੋ ਕੇ ਵਿਚਰਨਾ ਗੁਰੂ ਗ੍ਰੰਥ ਗੁਰੂ ਪੰਥ ਨੂੰ ਮੁੱਖ ਰੱਖਦਿਆਂ ਹੋਇਆਂ, and that means establishing all of these institutions of power and of sovereignty on our own terms. And I think taking that responsibility very, very seriously, understanding that there are no shortcuts, this is not something that's going to happen overnight, and understanding the gravity of this moment and the opportunities that it has for us, and the threshold that we're on of a massive conflict, and how are we going to prepare for that? ਅਧਿਆਤਮਕ ਪੱਖ ਤੋਂ ਵੀ, ਨਿੱਜੀ ਤੇ ਇੰਡੀਵਿਜੂਅਲ ਤੌਰ ਤੇ ਵੀ, ਤੇ ਜਥੇਬੰਦਕ ਤੌਰ ਤੇ.
Thank you so much, Parmjit Singh, and thank you for everyone for listening and watching. Please do share this episode and subscribe to the Panth-Punjab project if you haven't. Our goal is to facilitate critical discussions that analyze our current socio-political conditions and reflect on the future of our Sangharsh. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa.
Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.